This series has documented NATO's march to Russia's borders, despite a written assurance in 1990 by American Secretary of State James Baker not to advance 1 inch to the east. NATO members suffered from this American-led effort with demands to boost military spending and to cut trade with Russia. A long-time goal of the American empire is to sabotage relations between Germany and Russia. American neocons fear that vast Russian natural resources, combined with efficient German industry, would produce superior products and displace American goods. A key objective was to stop the $10.8 billion undersea natural gas pipeline project, mostly funded by Russia, Germany, and France. American President Donald Trump imposed sanctions on European companies building Nord Stream 2 in 2018, deeming it dangerous to Europe. This pleased Poland and Ukraine, who collect large transit fees from existing pipelines. Russia ensured the completion of Nord Stream 2, and it was finished in September 2021, as workers celebrated. The Americans pressured their German puppets to not allow it to open for regulatory reasons. It remained closed for over a year until Russia could be provoked to invade eastern Ukraine, thus providing an excuse to keep it closed. This cost Germany billions of dollars, and much higher natural gas prices put many German companies out of business. This was unpopular in Germany, but voters had no say since Germany is ruled by the United States. American President Joe Biden, shown here with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, openly said that he would ensure Nord Stream 2 never opened. After this pipeline was blown up in 2022, to prevent the Germans from using it in the future, Scholz didn't order an investigation because he knew the Americans were responsible. See the short tale linked in the description, the American colony called Germany. The Americans continue to block peace efforts in Ukraine while spending billions of dollars to build up the Ukrainian army to soon fight Russia. This was politically difficult in Ukraine because the large majority of its citizens wanted peace with Russia, evidenced by the 2019 election of Volodymyr Zelenskyy as president with 73% of the vote, which included strong support from ethnic Russians. He was a native Russian speaker who supported the rights of Ukrainian minorities and promised to peacefully end the fighting with Russian rebels. President Zelenskyy became unpopular in Ukraine as his political opponents criticized his refusal to enact a Paris peace agreement he signed in 2019 to end the conflict with Russia. In 2021, Zelenskyy shut down 3 television stations that allowed criticism of him and pressured Facebook and YouTube to shut down accounts of political opponents, some of whom he arrested. He ordered the internet censored in Ukraine, canceled the 2023 parliamentary elections, and the 2024 presidential election that he was sure to lose. As a result, Ukraine is no longer a free, democratic nation, but an American vassal state.
Кто-то подскажет, как сегодня называется наша страна? Может, мы что-то не знаем? Пожалуйста. Речпорт, Киев. И вот такая картинка. Интересная. Многоговорящая.
As explained in previous episodes in this series, Ukraine never abided by the 2016 Minsk peace accords and continued random tank and artillery fire into rebel-held cities, killing some 14,000 ethnic Russians since 2015. On the eve of the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine, The buildup of Russian troops on the eastern border of the Donbass was heavily reported. Unreported was the buildup of Ukrainian troops on Donbass's western border that preceded it. Ukraine had massed 60,000 troops along its border with Donbass rebels, as reported by Kim Iverson.
The generals from the Donbass region, the Lugansk and the Donetsk regions, and they had been, actually you could see their videos, well, I don't know if you can anymore, I think they've been removed, but they were saying, we are getting intelligence that the Ukrainian military is going to come into Donbass and try to do a hostile takeover of the region again. And so they were sounding the alarm when the U.S. was saying, oh, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade. The Donbass military leaders were saying, we're getting word that the Ukrainians are coming in and they're going to invade us in the civil war conflict. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could technically call it an invasion if they're invading their own technical territory. But, look, the Western media wouldn't, I think, broadcast the fact that there's intense shelling coming in from the Ukrainian side to Donbass, or that troops are amassing at the borders and threatening to take back Crimea or the Donbass regions. So it's an interesting perspective coming from this NATO official who, again, spent his entire career focusing on Eastern countries and helping build the Ukrainian military. So I found that particularly interesting that we're not getting that side of the perspective. We've been hearing
the Ukrainian troops were just not gathering on the border. According to United Nations data, 81% of ceasefire violations and civilian casualties in the past 7 years were caused by the Ukrainian army. In February 2022, European ceasefire observers, called the OSCE, observed a dramatic increase in Ukrainian artillery shelling into Donbass, prompting the Russians to intervene on February 24th. John Pilger is one of the most famous reporters in the world and still tells the truth. He was interviewed by a Hong Kong newspaper where he explained the Ukrainian conflict.
If you see it from the Russian side, without taking the side of Russia, it looks rather different. There was Russian troops, as you may remember, up to February, massing on the Ukrainian border, and they eventually invaded. That was the news on this side of the border. On the other side of the border, there were 60,000 Ukrainian troops who were massing on the line of contact right across Donbass. Now, Donbass, as far as the Russians are concerned, is the last stepping stone. You're close by Russia, you have a strategic advantage over Russia. Everything in modern Russian history, and in not so modern history, tells us that the Russians will never tolerate this, that they regard this as a threat, and they have much of their history to justify it. History is, in any discussion of geopolitics, history has to be part of one's analysis, even if it's not overt. It has to be understood. There has to be a basic knowledge of it to understand why things are happening or what is likely to happen. Our ignorance of Russia, like our ignorance of China in the West, allows none of that historical sense of how people see the threat and how political forces see the threat. I've spent my career working in the mainstream, and I've covered probably 7, 8, 9 shooting wars. I've never seen a coverage so utterly consumed by a tsunami of jingoism and of manipulated jingoism as this one. And that's why nothing should be trusted.
An example of the West's horrible news reporting is that no one is allowed to hear speeches given by Russian President Vladimir Putin explaining his actions in Ukraine. They are not found in Western news unless it's a snippet used out of context. The United States has blocked Americans from watching Russian news sources, but has not blocked the Kremlin's website, where you can watch Putin's 1-hour speech on February 21st, 2022, explaining his decision to intervene in the Donbass. His speech is linked in the description, where he says nothing about conquering Ukraine or recreating the Soviet Union. Several months later, he gave a 1-minute summary.
На протяжении десятилетий в западных странах постоянно культивировалась идея развала и Советского Союза, и исторической России, и России как таковой, ее ядра. К сожалению, только вызывает то, что с какого-то момента возникла идея использовать Украину для достижения этих целей. И, собственно говоря, ради того, чтобы предотвратить такое развитие событий, мы и начали специальную военную операцию. Именно к этому некоторые западные страны во главе США и стремились создать такой антироссийский анклав и вот раскачивать, угрожать России с этого направления. Именно это, по сути, является нашей главной целью – предотвратить подобное развитие событий.
The American empire is expanding to rule the world with the help of its NATO vassal states. In 2008, American President George Bush announced that NATO wanted to add Ukraine to NATO, even though most Ukrainians opposed the idea. Russia announced this would be unacceptable, while Germany and France said now is not the time to add Ukraine. NATO now has 31 members who all must approve of new members, so it's politically impossible to add Ukraine to NATO while it fights with Russia. However, the United States has already made Ukraine a de facto member, as Professor John Mearsheimer explained just days before the Russians intervened in the Donbass.
On a number of important occasions and in important documents during the course of 2021, the United States reiterated that it was explicitly committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Moreover, we were making Ukraine, over the course of 2021, and even before that, a de facto member of NATO. We were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were actually running training exercises like Operation Seabreeze with Ukrainian military forces. So Ukraine was well on its way to becoming a member of NATO. And again, as I said initially, we made it explicitly clear in documents that are public that we were fully committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So
as Ukraine slowly loses its war with Russia, many fear NATO will intervene militarily. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has spent years selling the dangerous idea of adding Ukraine to NATO. This led to disaster, yet Stoltenberg still promotes this insane idea that would lead to a world war.
In NATO, at the Vilnius summit, we made important decisions to help to move Ukraine closer to membership. We reiterated that Ukraine will become a member of NATO, but then we added 3 elements which actually move them closer to membership. First, we agreed a substantial package and also funding for a substantial package to ensure full interoperability between the Ukrainian armed forces and NATO. And interoperability between our armed forces is really a way to, in practical terms, move NATO closer, move Ukraine closer to NATO membership. The second thing we did was to strengthen the political institutionalized cooperation. We established something called the NATO-Ukraine Council, where we don't meet Ukraine as a partner, we meet as equals around the table, 31 allies, soon 32, and then with Ukraine around the table as an equal. This council can make decisions, it can convene on a short notice, it can address crisis, as we did just after the summit with when the grain deal was suspended, and the plan is now to really develop the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a practical, to an important tool to strengthen the bonds between NATO and Ukraine. And the third thing we did at the NATO summit was to remove the requirement for membership action plan for Ukraine to become a member. Because previously the idea was to grant the country membership action plan, and that was a step towards invitation. At the Vilnius summit, we said that there is no need for a membership action plan because Ukraine has already moved closer to NATO. So we turn now the membership process from a 2-step process to a 1-step process. And these 3 things, the interoperability, the NATO-Ukraine Council, and the removal of the requirement for a membership action plan for Ukraine, demonstrates that Ukraine has never been closer to a membership in NATO than now.
All NATO members will not agree to admit Ukraine during its war with Russia. So Stoltenberg suggests this is not required. He keeps stating that Ukraine will join NATO and took steps to speed up the process. His arrogance is frightening and suggests that if his American bosses tell him to admit Ukraine into NATO, he will proudly announce that we decided to admit Ukraine. So Russia must withdraw from Ukraine or NATO will respond with military force.